Going all the way back to the earliest memories of my youth, I have loved superheroes. Like, I've grown up on superheroes. I've had toys from back when superhero toys were kind of still newish. I've had t-shirts, undershirts, underoos, bed sheets, everything at some point in my life that can have superheroes on it, I've probably had with superheroes on it. And when it comes to television, some of my first television watching memories involve the Super Friends. So, with all that, I'm way past due in actually checking out My Hero Academia. But how does it hold up to an old American comic book fan? Let's find out. So, the nature of the story, like right from the very beginning, well, it really struck what I'll call a positive chord of nostalgia for me. Like, it reminded me of old superhero stories, like probably more from comic books than from animation or television. But sometimes they do leak into your movies, your television, your multimedia. But it really struck a positive chord of nostalgia for like that circa, I'm just going to say like 1986 Marvel Comics kind of zone when I really got into comic books and the stuff I really enjoyed. I don't know what the age of the mangaka who created My Hero Academia is, but I kind of wonder if they're sort of close to my age because it really feels like somebody who was raised on the same kind of Chris Claremont X-Men comics that I was raised on. But with the way this world had been described to me and the way I understood it, and even the way it was introduced to me near the beginning of the first episode, I really worried that a world in which everyone has powers wouldn't be interesting. And of course, not everyone has powers, but when the overwhelming majority, like 80, 90% of people have powers or quirks, as they call them in My Hero Academia, I get real worried. Like, suddenly, then it's commonplace because I love to say this. This isn't something I've coined, but it's a phrase I like to repeat. There's really only two kinds of stories in the world of fantasy and speculative fiction, that is, the magic person in a regular garden or the regular person in the magic garden. And when I tune in to watch My Hero Academia, my first worry is we're going to have a magic person in a magic garden, which is not interesting. But we learn a few things that change my point of view on that. First off, we learn that not all quirks are created equal. I mean, it's like any other kind of competitive sport. Some guy might have in basketball, a better jump shot than other people, even though everybody can shoot the ball, you know? So with quirks, some quirks seem to have a more obvious value to the heroing community than other quirks. And I really get to learn that and have some fun with that when we see the various students in the school and you really get to ask, like, how is a guy going to use this weird power to actually do anything beneficial with fighting crime? And that too is a little bit nostalgic for me, but that comes a little bit later, like with the Grant Morrison run on the X-Men. Some really bizarre mutations were popping up that seemed like they weren't very useful. And then you can even step it back to Chris Claremont with the X-Men in the 80s, and he's got the Morlocks living in the sewer, and some of those powers are just quirky, which is why quirk I like as a name for that ability rather than power, because not all of them are perceived as powers. They're just traits or quirks that not everyone else has. But then also, when I realized this is a story I could relate to, and this might be a story for me, is that Deku starts with no quirk. So here I do see that the story is defined as a regular person in a magic garden, with Deku being the person who has no quirk. And then even when he does develop a quirk, he's got some struggles and some challenges there, but we'll talk about that when we get to that point. But this does give me an entryway where they're sort of flipping our typical superhero story on its head. And when I look at the ages of the people involved, I think about Spider-Man, or maybe Ultimate Spider-Man, the Miles Morales incarnation, where they're like this one kid in a normal high school that's an outcast because they have this weird power and they can't tell people about it. Well, we get the reverse, where Deku is like the anti-Spider-Man, or the reverse Spider-Man, where he's the one who doesn't have the quirk or the power and everybody else around him does, and we still get to see that outsider status and how does he come to deal with it. It makes it really satisfying as the story unfolds in the way that it does in the first season, for me at least. And then we get to have some fun when All Might sort of takes Deku under his wing, and then Deku gets a massive superpower, but he doesn't know how to use it. He has to learn how to use it, and there's a whole lot of conflict that you can introduce into the storytelling in person versus himself style when he doesn't quite know how to control that power, how to use that power. You deal with the internal frustration of knowing I should be able to solve this problem, but I just don't know how to use these abilities to do so yet. So that's a lot of fun. We get to see like a fan surrogate. Deku is like the kid I was who daydreamed of getting superpowers, only Deku actually gets to live out the daydream. So, of course, an old guy like me gets to live vicariously through Deku and go back to my youth, even though it's a story set in the future. I feel like I'm living in the past. But also, the way Deku doesn't quite know how to use his powers, he hurts himself pretty severely when he first starts trying to use it. And this not knowing how to use the powers, well, for me and being my age and some of the things I've already talked about, well, this reminds me of Greatest American Hero. I mean, if you remember that classic first half of the 80s superhero show about a guy who gets a suit that gives him superpowers, but he has no idea how to use them. So he's got to figure it out as he goes along, got to figure out how to control it. Iconically, the thing that defined that show sort of as a meme, if you will, was that he knew how to fly, but he had no idea how to land. So he always had these hilarious, rough landings every time he landed from flying. Well, we get to see something similar every time Deku jumps. He breaks his own legs because he can't handle the power. He flips a baseball with the finger, breaks the finger, punches something, shatters his hand. So he has that same kind of violence, like I can do the front part of the ability, but I just can't bring it home on the backside. Reminds me of Greatest American Hero. And as a child, I was really fascinated and obsessed with Greatest American Hero. On rewatch, it absolutely has nostalgic value, but I don't know how well it holds up. However, unlike the Greatest American Hero, Deku has people to help him learn how to use his power. Like he has a one-to-one mentor with All Might, the person who gave him his abilities, whereas in The Greatest American Hero, the aliens dropped it off and they were out of there and the instruction manual got broken, yada yada. Well, fortunately for Deku, he's got the man who gave him the power and who has used that power for an unknown number of years, probably at least 20 years, I would imagine. And he also has a whole school, a whole academy, a high school, UA High School is all there to help him and other students learn how to be someone with powers and how to live the heroing lifestyle and how to help society and so on and so forth. And a lot of things that, well, in The Greatest American Hero, all he had was some guy from like the FBI or CIA who was a jerk. And I do think, as far as like this mentor-mentee relationship between All Might and Deku, that we get a lot of what one might expect from that relationship, with the frustrated youth who just wants to jump into the power, the older person who's saying, you're not ready yet, you're not ready yet. I mean, take whatever you want. Take Jedi and a Padawan, take a military leader and their protege. I mean, it's just kind of a standard storytelling way to do it, and it plays out like you would expect. Also, for some reason, and maybe it's just because of the recency of the whole thing, but I had a lot of like the Iron Man Spider-Man dynamic from the recent Spider-Man movies where Tony Stark, Iron Man, is kind of a mentor and provides him with an updated suit and advice, but then Spider-Man still finds himself rushing into the heat of battle that Tony Stark thinks he's not ready for yet. You get a lot of that same dynamic here with All Might, and it's stuff I'm familiar with. And seeing something that's familiar does help pull you into a story, particularly if, like me, you had some mixed feelings going into it and you're a little hesitant to get into it. A few things that are familiar that I can latch onto and say, you know what, I'm welcome in this space. Those kind of things help. And I think we got some of that with the All Might Deku storyline. Now, the Bakugo storyline caught me off guard. And the fact that it did catch me off guard and it didn't necessarily fit into the sort of trope pathways I was assigning to it in the beginning, well, that made me find it very interesting. So now it's one of my favorite storylines, one of my favorite supporting characters. I don't know quite how to say it because I don't necessarily like the guy, but I love the story being told about the guy and around Bakugo. And the fact that I really thought this was a clear setup for like Doctor Doom and Reed Richards, friends in school. Then they get a little jealous of one another. One of them becomes the villain, one of them becomes the hero. I thought we were going that way. But now by the end of the first season, I think Bakugo is definitely firmly dedicated to being a hero and not a villain, which means I'll probably be wrong again. Who knows? Only time will tell. But now I'm seeing some kind of mutual respect friendship being built from these two. Almost kind of like Iceman and Maverick in the original Top Gun, if you're old enough to remember any of that storyline. And then I do love the idea of Superpower Academy. A superhero school, a superhero academy. Of course, its inspiration, as far as I can recall, probably goes back to Professor X's School for Gifted Youth and the X-Men. But this whole idea of following a set group of people through the levels as they progress through their training through the superhero academy, well, that absolutely reminds me of a book series I love by a writer named Drew Hayes. It's called Superpowered. And it's about this world where not everybody has quirks, but there are sort of like three types of people: normies, who have no powers. Then there are supers who have powers they can control. And then there are people called powards that have powers but no control over them. So a group of powards undergo this experimental thing to give them control and try to become supers. They go to the Super Training Academy and we follow them through. And I love that book series. Highly recommend, if you like My Hero Academia and you like to read, that you check out the independently published Superpowered by Drew Hayes. I'm not being asked in any way to endorse it. I just really enjoy that story. This reminds me of that. Once again, the value of comfort, the value of like similar stories and being able to relate to it. Well, that's part of what I enjoy about a news story. So I like to mention the things that I think of when I watch this to you guys when I do these videos. And whenever you're dealing with very, very large superhero groups, you always have to be hesitant, or you always have to have some concern, or at least I always have a little bit of concern or fear that if there's too many characters, it gets kind of bland. And if there's too many superheroes, it gets kind of bland. So I was worried about that. That was some negative baggage I was bringing into My Hero Academia, but I feel like they've dealt with it surprisingly well, particularly with the way that they focus on certain characters in certain situations. Right now, a lot of people seem like background characters. We've only met maybe 3 really of the professors and just a handful of the students. So I think they're managing it well. But of course, anytime you have too many characters, you start to run out of ideas. No matter what creator and how talented they are, there's still not a bottomless pit of ideas. So eventually you start to struggle. You get some work out there that's, let's just say, not your A game when you're throwing that many out there, and you got to come up with that many powers. And sometimes when you run out of ideas for designs and for powers, well, maybe you get a guy who has a squirrel tail, and as far as I can tell, not much else. So then you do get, and of course you get lots of familiar stuff. I mean, lots of stuff that I can look and say, okay, this guy is like Iceman from the X-Men, obviously. This guy is like Gambit. This guy is like Spider-Man. I mean, obviously there's going to be a lot of thinly veiled homages to established characters, and there's only so many archetypes and so many types of powers, but you also get some of the silly ones. But also, as part of that, I think that not all of the lame powers are because people ran out of ideas, but some of the lame powers I think are lame on purpose to have a little fun with it, to create a certain type of character, to give us some comedic support throughout the story. I mean, the biggest case in point of the lame on purpose superpower, in my opinion, or at least what I'm guessing, is Sticky Balls. Mineta, I think is his name. But Sticky Balls, kind of a lame power. I think there's a character called Gold Balls that could do something similar. I don't know. I never really read much Marvel comics with Gold Balls. I do know Speedball, which has way more to do with his powers than just Sticky Balls. But Sticky Balls, Mineta, lame, but I think it's lame on purpose, right? I mean, they definitely make the character kind of a joke. Now, I do like the UA school uniform design. And I think the school uniforms really help both the artists and the creators with character design, because instead of thinking up 500 unique costumes all at once, you can put a bunch of people in these school uniforms and then take your time coming up with, battle outfits for them as they need to be. And, it kind of helps having that uniformity. You look back at the old days, the original days, 1963, I guess, era of the X-Men, and they all kind of had their matching school uniforms. They had their standard X-Men uniform. That way, the more people you brought in, you didn't have to keep coming up with new uniforms. Of course, that went by the wayside as people found out that art really sells the comics, and outlandish and colorful uniforms became the norm for everybody. But I do like that little throwback. Time and time again, I'm thinking of X-Men when I'm watching My Hero Academia. The school uniforms, probably a part of that. Something I didn't expect, but it makes sense when I see it, and something that's also fun, but once again, equally taxing on the creators, the writers, the artists, etc., is that the villains are just as numerous and as unusual as the heroes. And we get a whole lot of interesting character designs for villains, too. And, a villain has typically a different aesthetic than a hero, so hopefully the villain ideas don't start causing you to run dry on superhero ideas. They kind of seem in their own basket, but once again, A whole lot of fun. There's got to be some characters for everybody out there when you look at how many different heroes and villains they throw in there. But some of my favorite designs, I think from the superhero side, from the hero side, my favorite design so far has got to be All Might in business attire. I really like All Might in his professor suit or that golden pinstripe double breasted business suit. I find that way more interesting to look at than his actual superhero All Might costume. And I think he just looks sharp. It's drawn perfectly. They get the perfect shading and shadows on it. It just looks so bold and heroic and like he's there to be serious and not to play around. I love it. On the villain side of things, I am just super intrigued by that villain with the hands attached all over him. And, I have to apologize. I've forgotten his name, but he showed up quite a bit in those last 3, 4 episodes of the season. Got an interesting quirk that he can make people rot, which makes him really imposing. But I still want to know, like, what's up with those hands all over him. I want to see if we find more story, more backstory out about this guy. Find out more about where these hands come from and why they're there. Because from what I can tell, and I'm not always the sharpest tack in the bin, but from what I can tell, he doesn't need those hands for his quirk. But boy, it's a creepy thing to look at. And I just find the character interesting to look at. And one of those that would make for a nice poster to kind of hang up on your wall or something. But overall, I think this first season gave us a good foundation from which to tell a long, interesting, perhaps epic superhero story. And that's what the first season's there to do, right? To lay down that good foundation, to get you interested, familiarize you with the world and the characters and the rules of the world and the aspirations of the character. And then from there, the real story can unfold. So with 13 episodes, there's only so much they can do, but they showed us the quirks in action. They showed us the challenges that both the heroes and the students face, the teachers and the students, Deku's unique situation. And I know with all this large cast and with new students coming and some old students going out, there can constantly be turnover, a whole lot of story they can tell in future seasons. So I think season 1 did its job admirably well. And it did still leave us with a few nuggets of mystery. Like you can't answer every question in season 1 or there's no reason to check out season 2. But for me, the biggest nugget of mystery I'm left with has to deal with All Might. And he's talked about the all for one or the one for all. Yeah, the one for all power that he's passing on to Deku. And we get the idea it's been passed down to him by someone else. He's using the power less and less. We got to know the story of this injury a little bit better. And the limitations of the small might versus all might. So I do like it. We've still got a pretty big nugget of mystery there with the origin of the power that has made its way to Deku. I want to learn more about that. And I'm sure a whole lot more mysteries will be introduced. Why were the villains so determined to get All Might at the time they decided to get him? I think there's going to be some more story there. So I'm just looking forward to seeing that unfold and see how this dynamic continues to develop between Deku and All Might as sort of a father-son relationship, and then we're going to go into the inevitable adolescent striking out or rebelling against the instructions of All Might. Maybe All Might dies like Tony Stark did. I don't know, but I'm looking forward to finding out. Also, something else they can explore in future seasons are the villains, because as they showed us at the end of season 1, there are just as many villains as there are heroes, and they're just as diverse and interesting and unique. And it makes me wonder, like, do the villains have an academy? Like, can we spend a little bit of time in the villains academy? Or is the villains academy underground? I don't know. But I do know that there was a cool concept in a superhero training academy story. It was actually a podcast. The Adventure Zone graduation arc was all about this one school that trained both heroes and villains at the same place, because in a lot of ways the skills they needed to learn were overlapped. And some people might go in majoring in being a hero and decide they're better at being a villain. Kind of an interesting setup for a story. So maybe there's a part of this UA high school that caters to potential villains. I don't know. But I am looking forward to exploring other characters beyond Deku and All Might. There's so many characters here, and I think there's so many good stories to tell. And Attack on Titan really showed me just how much depth supporting characters can have and just how interesting exploring those supporting characters can be. And people are telling me My Hero Academia does not shy away from that, so I can't wait to see some of those stories. I also think potentially it would be interesting to explore different eras in the My Hero Academia world. Kind of like Star Wars. With Star Wars, you can go back and some stories can be told during the last days of the Republic, and some days can be told during the early days of the Empire, and then some are told like after the Empire and the New Republic's taken over, and then those interregnum years, or the way, way past. I think My Hero Academia could do that and tell some interesting stories, like from the time when All Might was first becoming a hero and first learning to use his power, and see how alike and or different he and Deku are. Or have some throwback episodes that show All Might in America and how he got such love for things like the Texas Smash and the Detroit Smash and the California Smash and that sort of thing. I think that would be kind of interesting, not only to explore both heroes and villains, but to look at different eras. And you could even look at like 20 years in the future with a new generation of students at UA High School. I think all that would be fair game for storytelling. But I do think that's all I've got for this particular review. Fully enjoyed season 1 of My Hero Academia. I'd put it above the middle of the pack for sure. I think it's probably going to get better in following seasons. I'm definitely finding my relationship with it, so it'll be easy for me to continue to watch. And I'm just going to say that I'm proud of you for watching anime, and I'll talk to you again soon.
I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon. It really means a lot to me. If you might be interested in Patreon perks like early access to videos, uncut reaction videos, ad-free videos, and the opportunity to vote on which anime will be covered in the future, then click on the link in the video description. Thank you.